Hello everyone, and welcome to the Squidcast, the weekly metagame Splatoon discussion podcast. I'm your host, FLC, and as usual, we're bringing you a bunch of the talking points from the Academy Discord server, the link for which you can find in the title of the stream, or in the description if you're catching up on YouTube. The Academy is the best place for anyone who wants to improve at Splatoon. We discuss all manner of topics, from gear builds to competitive strategies, and anyone can come join in. Just make sure you take a look through the welcome messages, it'll tell you everything you need to know. As usual, we have 4 segments lined up for you today, all to do with building team compositions. This stuff is also useful for anyone playing solo as well, so if you're just here trying to get better at, get your rank up, get up to S+ and whatever, this can sort of help you assess your place in a team, for example, on solo queue. First up, we'll be taking a quick look at tier lists, how you actually use them. You see them everywhere, but people sort of don't really understand what they mean, particularly for a shooter. To expand on that, we're then going to look into the synergy within a weapon kit, so for example why the 10 attack is so popular and effective. In the third segment, we're going to be going over some of the synergy in team compositions, so extending what we go over in the second segment into making a proper team composition for competitive. And finally, we're going to be opening up to the chat, and we're going to discuss some examples of synergy in kits and team compositions. So, joining me today, we have 3 particularly experienced competitive players. First up, we have Dawnwall, who's the co-founder of and plays Dynamo 4. Team name goes here. What's up?
Hello. How are you guys?
Alright, we've got Hermes as well, who's another co-founder of Team name goes here. He plays Charger for them. How's it going?
Yep. It's going all good. Hope you guys are excited for some fun team building stuff.
And finally, we've got Mango, who ran the team S3 for almost a year. He plays a wide range of weapons. How's it going? Alright, good stuff. So, let's take a look at first topic. So, again, we're talking about synergy today. Now, one of the things that a lot of people see in Reddit and Squid boards and even Discord servers and so on is tier lists. So, I mean, you see them all over the place, but people don't really know what they're doing. A lot of people will take offense to their weapon being ranked low, for example, or others will assume that a tier list directly translates to, being successful. So, like, if you use a top tier weapon, you'll automatically do well. But I want to address that. I want to make it a little bit clearer as to what a tier list in a shooter actually is. So let's start with Mango in this one. So I think because you've played so many different weapons, you know full well what it means to change between different classes of weapons. I mean, there's you've played chargers, you've played shooters, you've played blasters. So when you look at a tier list, for example, what are you actually trying to see in that tier list?
Well, I mean, if I'm looking at a tier list, I'm probably doing something like, what niche does this weapon fulfill in, and will?
Oh. I think your sensitivity's a bit messed up. Yeah, you're cutting out a bit. But yeah, so basically looking at the niches that the weapon fills, yes?
Yeah, I could agree with that.
Alright, so let's go over some examples of that. So, say you see a 10 attack in the top tier, which you quite often do. What does that imply for you? What would you be taking as that meaning?
I guess. Well, generally, I think that weapon could fulfill a great role in maybe competitive scenarios and solo scenarios and in a wide variety of circumstances, its kit supplements everything the weapon needs to do well.
Right.
And it can fulfill a strong niche in a wide range of situations.
Right, so the flexibility then would be the thing you're taking out of that.
Probably.
Right, so, I mean, we also see, that flexibility is definitely a big thing. I definitely agree with that, because, you see the 10 attack, and things like the 96 scale, before it was nerfed, things like the CRB, Custom Range Blaster. These weapons all are quite strong because like the flexibility there is that you can put them in most situations and they'll do quite well in those situations. But something I find interesting is that there are a bunch of weapons, like for example the E-liter, that seem to be placed really highly on tier lists, even though you could easily argue that an E-liter that doesn't have control going for it might, for example, not be able to do very much.
I can definitely attest to that.
Yeah. So yeah, Hermes, you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to describe a tier list, and I think the one thing that our community is kind of revolving around with tier lists is they're trying to lump everything together. I think that there is definitely a solo queue tier list and a like team comp building tier list, for example. Like in solo queue, you're going to have the weapons that are flexible, can handle themselves really well in many situations, and the weapons that punish incredibly well are going to be super high. Because since there's lack of communication, lots of people are going to make mistakes. I'm pretty sure a lot of us have heard your talk on this before. Like, it works really well in solo. However, when you're building a team composition for like a competitive match in, say, Monsoon or one of the Battlefight tournaments going on in North America coming up, you're going to be looking for weapons that synergize well together and work together to push objective forward well, which is why I think the E-liter in solo is not that high. It can do well, but it's not too high. However, in, say, a team composition, like a full-fledged comp, it's going to be way up there because an E-liter with the right communication with its team can do so much. They're at the back normally, so they're going to have really good callouts. They normally have some good backline beacons. They're a safe jump for their teammates normally. They have a lot of things going for them, which is why they're normally so high ranked, is because everyone's mixing the two when they still suffer a lot in solo.
Yeah, so basically, like, there's more to it than just, like, it's not a one-dimensional thing, is basically what we're getting at here. I'm sort of, this was a bit of a leading question, to be fair, because I think this isn't something you really, this isn't as much of a discussion as a, like, this is how it is, I guess, because, like, you see E-liters ranked high, and that's because when they're in the correct circumstances, it's really, really good, And then Tenatech is really high because you can put it in any circumstance and it will perform, right? So there's sort of a bunch of different aspects that go into putting a weapon high or low on a tier list. And I think another important thing is that tier lists are not... They take things like skill as constant. So if you have a tier list where it's like E-liter and Tenatech and CRB and Dynamo and whatnot all at the top, what you're assuming is that whoever plays those weapons is equally experienced with all of those weapons, and like is experienced enough to actually make full use of them. Whereas like, if you have someone who's like, in the B ranks just working their way up, and they see a tier list and they see the custom range blasters at the very top, and they switch over to custom range blaster, they're probably not going to do very well with it because it's such a difficult weapon. So, whereas with something like a Tenatech, it's a lot easier, even though you can go quite far in terms of skill ceiling with that weapon. So there's a lot that isn't included in tier lists as well that I think people probably should be taking more into account. So speaking of dynamos, Dawn, you've been using Dynamo for a fair while now. But you're one of the few remaining Western Dynamo players. Most of the Western Dynamo players have either quit or moved on to different weapons. Even though the Dynamo is considered a very, very powerful weapon, why do you think that might be?
I can't speak. I'm not representative of every Dynamo main out there, but it's gotta be the fact that in every single patch, with the exception of this latest patch, this Dynamo has been nerfed and nerfed and nerfed. And I personally feel that the weapon itself has not lost its efficacy because it still paints. It's probably the best painter out of literally every single weapon in the game. I'm not counting subs or specials in all this.
Yep.
And people are just they get demotivated so easily. They see, oh, looky here, another patch. What's next for the Dynamo? Another nerf?
Yep,
So,
and half the time they're right, so...
Well, I don't blame them because Dynamo has been an especially popular weapon in the Japanese meta for the longest time. I mean, if you look at people like Dynamon and Kit Kat, they've really put in work with their dynamos, and it shows. People are afraid of them. The West, I think, had a knee-jerk reaction to the nerfs. Mango, I can hear you from here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think.
But what kept me using the dynamo though is because I'm not an aggressive dynamo. I'm not like Mario. I'm not like, say, I forget who else here. I'm not like Bio or Mario where I'm an aggressive dynamo. But I'm not like Vera either where I'm entirely sitting there in the back just inking things for the rest of the team.
Right.
What really helps me keep with the dynamo is the fact that, well, I like painting, and the dynamo does just that. And my team appreciates the painting, and this painting capacity is the thing that keeps Dynamo elevated in many people's tier list, in spite of its being punished so severely by the developers.
Right.
Also,
So that's yeah. Go ahead.
he
Sorry.
does ink, and it's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, because like that's another thing that I think we'll get more into in the third segment, but just having a Dynamo on your team who actually paints all the time, just giving a sideways glance to Mario there, that actually allows a lot of weapons that might be lower on the tier list. So, for example, what's a good example of a weapon that really needs
CRB.
Well, CRB is usually top tier anyway, but
Yeah.
like the CRB is really unlocked by having a Dynamo or something else that paints. I know the Grim, for example, is even more so because the Grim doesn't have like the Kraken or whatever to get in. Like if you get stuck in ink or something as a Grim, you don't really have many options. You're kind of screwed. You have like 2 burst bombs before you're out of ink, and then you have to either be gone or you have to have killed everyone. And with only half a tank of ink with a Grim, that generally doesn't happen. So, but then having the Dynamo on your team that you can work with the ink and so on. Actually, Chaotic brings up a good point in chat. The turf really helps things like the carbon, the super short range sharking weapons that can just insta kill people as long as they have any kind of turf control, but then sort of run out of options when they don't have it. I know, like, I don't want to get too far into the Japanese versus Western meta today, but I know that a lot of the way the Japanese teams approach turf control is they'll try to have as much turfing happening as possible at any one time, hence this quick respawn stealth jump and whatnot, so that no matter what, all of the weapons that they have in their team can always function, which I think is something else that the Dynamo does really well. But I think just to sort of sum this up, like the tier list that you see usually have a bunch of different metrics that, like, they're necessarily simplifying the problem, right? You have in this game you have 3 different competitive modes anyway. You have you have solo queue, you have squads, you have competitive, and of course different weapons work well with different teammates. Like if you have 4 CRBs on a team, they might be all top tier weapons, but they're not going to paint anything. And if they run out of paint, then they're not. If they run out of turf to move around in, they're not going to be able to be all that effective. So basically, the point here is that tier lists don't tell you the whole story. They give you a framework to work with. They tell you what kinds of weapons tend to be effective, and then you can build upon that to figure out the rest. And
SLC, if I may say something before we move on to the next topic, tier lists also give you some insight into the person who made them. So, for example, if I made a tier list, I'd have Dynamo ranked at the near top tier because I highly value its painting capacity, and I'd have weapons like, say, GRB ranked a bit lower than they would actually be because they don't paint as well. That's just a more extreme and simplistic example, but again, tier lists are a way to get good insight into the person that made them.
Sure. So one of the things with tier lists is that you have to take into account things that are not part of that tier list in order to use them properly. And one of those things is synergy. Now, we sort of alluded to this before, but okay, apparently that's not there. Oh, well, whatever. So synergy is a kind of a tricky concept because there are so many different variables involved in it, particularly once you start looking at multiple different weapons. So it's a lot easier, though, to start off looking at how weapon kits by themselves will synergize together. So we talked about, I pointed out the Tenatech in the intro. Basically, I think the way to look at this is when you have a really good synergy within a kit, the weapon becomes sort of more than the sum of its parts, if I may use a cliche. And we can talk about how weapon kits come together and make and are synergistic in order to then extend that into team compositions later. So the first thing I want to bring up is how you actually assess kits. So I think a lot of people do tend to look at weapons as sort of the main is separate from the sub and special. Like if you use a Tenatech, it's and then use a Wasabi, clearly they're the same main weapon, so they should play similarly. A lot of the time this is actually the case, but I think, Dawn, you've been using Dynamo for long enough now that I think you can offer some a bit more insight onto how the three Dynamos, for example, stack up against each other and how the synergy with those things work.
Alrighty, so I'll start off with the vanilla Dynamo roller since everybody loves the vanilla. Since everyone loves vanilla. So let me go boot up an article because I don't have this knowledge on top of my head right now. Okay, Dynamo rollers, sub and special, are Sprinkler and Echolocator. I'm gonna take this from the perspective of a person who has just started ranked, is at C-, not the literal team, mind you, but someone who's just starting off on their ranking systems. They see the Dynamo top tier. They're questioning, why is this thing top tier? Disregarding the main weapon, which is slow as balls. You have Sprinklers, which aren't offensive, and Echolocator, which does nothing to give you extra offensive potential. That being said, though, once you start hitting the upper echelons of rank, you can start seeing the value of the Dynamo in that its sub-weapon, Sprinklers, while a questionable decision at first, are actually helpful because it effectively doubles the Dynamo's inking output. An Echolocator lets you keep tabs on just about everyone and everything on the field because you can have your teammates on your gamepad where you can see where they are, and then once you pop an Echo, you can see where everyone else is, and then your massive ink output will let you see if people are trying to cut through it to get to you. So the Dynamo roller itself is very, very synergistic for playing support, and it, in my opinion, is the absolute best support weapon in the entire game. Literally, so many other weapons get their potential unlocked, as you mentioned earlier, FLC, when the Dynamo is playing alongside them.
Yeah, so
Now-
basically, sorry. So basically what you're saying is the Silver Dynamo is really, really good for the paint control because the kit builds up its strengths. So you've got your double inking, as you said, and then the Echolocator as well sort of assists with like it's mass Echolocators. You get several every game very easily, and you can just constantly have the entire team marked. But then you have the Tempered and the Gold Dynamo, which have a very different approach, I would say.
Yeah, definitely different. Compared to Silver, Gold and Tempered are much more offensive. They're much more aggressive. Basically, instead of playing a bit passive and relying on the main weapon to do the killing, the Gold Dynamo, I'll focus on that one since I've been playing with that one more recently, relies on its splat bombs to weed people out, for lack of a better term, kind of like what CRB does with its splat bombs. It also uses splat bombs to help generate space, like to force people into or out of the wave, most times out because people don't like dynamos. And then Ink Strike itself is another way to approach the double inking concept, in that it's basically a gigantic grenade that you can drop anywhere on the map. It's kind of like the Silver, except it's much more offensive, and you don't get that fifth player in the Sprinkler.
Right.
And Tempered's an even more extreme case of aggression because a Dynamo's main problem is, well, its lack of ability to move. And another problem is that it has no recourse against... Silver Dynamo has absolutely zero recourse against weapons that outrange it, whereas Gold at least gets bombs. and Ink Strike, which again are something but not everything. Tempered gets direct recourse against the weapons that outrange it with killer whales, and trust me, the Tempered Dynamo is a whale machine. I've generated at least 10 whales in one match before. It's kind of scary when you think about it.
Right, so like what you've got here is, I mean, as you were saying, the Silver Dynamo sort of the Sprinkler and Echo kit makes the Dynamo's painting strength greater, so it really focuses on that, like exacerbating its strengths. But then you've got the Silver Dynamo, the Gold Dynamo and the Tempered. The Tempered covers one of its weaknesses, which is mobility, and you've got the Gold Dynamo, which covers... It's sort of a bit in between, I guess you would say. It's more of an aggressive thing, but...
Gold's for those more aggressive players, so kind of like High Graph if you're watching this, BT Dubs, and Mario,
right.
who I just would make more use out of a more aggressive loadout than like Splat Bomb Ink Strike than, say, Vera or I would.
Right, so I wanted to get into the Dynamo because I think that assessment is... I think it does show that not only is the main weapon... Like, the main weapon's important, obviously, because in all of these cases you have a really high painting, long-range, sort of one-shot killing Dynamo. It's really slow, so it always has the same weaknesses, at least in terms of mobility. But then how the sub and special factor into that is going to significantly change how the main weapon works. And this is what I mean by assessing a kit holistically. And it's not just, okay, well, Dynamos are slow, but they put out a lot of paint and they kill things in one shot, and then Sprinklers are kind of nice for painting stuff, and then Echo is really good because it shows the other team. You actually have to take all of the aspects of a kit into account. And so I think we can look at... we've got some people in the chat wanting to talk about 52 Decker, which I guess we can do. But we can also look at the Tenatech and Custom Range Blaster, I think. So, Mango, I think you've played both of these weapons quite a bit, at least the CRB. So, what is it about the Tenatech and CRB in particular that makes their kits work so well with those main weapons?
Well, when I'm using like a...
Oh, are we okay?
Yeah.
Alright.
When I'm using a Tenatech, I'd use my suctions to opportunistically. I get essentially a good lead in into everything, and that's what makes it a pretty strong weapon. I haven't played it in a while, so I can like entirely tell you everything. CRB, on the other hand, I have played quite a bit. I feel its entirety of its kit works relatively well. You have your great zoning opportunity because the fact that it just has that amazing range and that factor that it can one shot and everything. And it's supplemented by its bombs that, oh, this isn't going to move, or this guy isn't going to do that. All right, so let me put my bomb here. I have a bomb range. Just do that. And then you get a lot of great zoning. And then it really depends on the niche that the weapon fulfills.
Right, so because of the kit having, like, the CRB itself is sort of a risky weapon, I would say. Like, you want to be going for direct hits. You can actually see in the footage I'm playing Grim, but direct hits with the range blasters are part of what make them so strong. Because they're very, very quick kills. Like, they're practically instant. And the range blaster in particular has a very long range as well. So, I think, you know, you look at that and you say, well, what happens if you miss a shot, right? So you have the splat bombs as things that can either damage enemies so that you can actually kill them in one shot. So, for example, if you use a damage up build, or, you know, you have the splat bombs as well to sort of cover your shorter range areas. So, like, you can slow people down if they're coming in. You can give them sort of pause for thought while you just get a direct on them or something like that. And then, of course, there's the Kraken, where if you miss a direct and someone's rushing you down, you can just Kraken and, like, kill them. And meanwhile, you know, you got the Tenatech, which it's a short-range weapon, but it paints really well, so which means it paints really well. So, like, you have, with the suctions, it gives you a way to paint safely from longer range so that you can build up the Inksuker and start taking people out. And, you can get very fast, very effective Inksukers that way, while also killing enemies who come in, like, close, and trying to, and, you can really easily shark them. And, obviously, there's also the usual stuff with suctions. Like, you don't lose any of the normal stuff that you can do with suctions. When you have a synergistic kit, the suctions will still be really useful for trapping and really useful for painting and so on. But that, either the things that they do will be even better, because, for example, the Tenatech wants to force people into its range, and the suctions are just the right range to do that. And, the Tenatech builds the Inksukers really quickly, and that's really nice to be able to push extra Inksukers out with your extra turf ability. But then, you have, and sort of the opposite end of this is when you have a kit that, looks like it's really good on paper, but then you actually use it and it sort of doesn't work out that well. Now, Hermes, I mentioned before the cast the NZAP 85. So the NZAP itself isn't really a bad weapon. Like, it's a 4-shot kill, which isn't ideal, but it puts down a lot of pain, has a really good run speed, so it turfs well. So it gets a lot of echoes, which is its special. And it's also got the splat bombs, which are generally considered one of the best sub-weapons in the game. But you don't really see that many NZAP 85s in competitive, or even in solo queue anymore. So why do you think that might be, just in the context of what we've just been talking about?
I mean, yeah, it's the kits. The way the kit on paper looks nice, but it doesn't work well with the weapon. Mainly because the weapon itself, if you look at the other kits offered for an NZAP, you have the like Turf War Specialist, the 89, and then you have the I'm gonna flank you, hunt you down, and kill you with the 83. The 85 just is kind of there as a support, and is very while it does have a better opportunity to actually be played well than, say, a Custom Junior, which I think we can all attest to. That kit is just not set up properly. It does have a better opportunity than that, but like, its echoes doesn't really help it much in terms of how the main weapon works. And the splat bombs themselves, like, as they're meant more for like a nice accent to close combat encounters, but it doesn't do it as well as, say, a Wasabi would, because the time to kill is slower, and it doesn't do it like a CRB does, because the CRB uses it for a lot of zoning, as Mango said. It just kind of falls flat because nothing really meshes well together. It just kind of is there. It's all good stuff, but it doesn't like stack on top of each other like, oh, this helps this helps this. It's like, it's all just there and not really doing much for each other.
Right, and I think chat is sort of jumping on this a little bit, and there's a good reason for that, which is that another reason the 85 isn't that good is because it shares a kit with the Deal Scorcher, which a lot of people are arguing is a better weapon just because of the extra range, and also because it has to compete with things like the Tenatech. Now, this I find interesting because a lot of people will compare weapons on the basis of, it's similar to a Tenatech because the main is similar, or it's similar to a duel because the kit is similar. And I think that's interesting because it shows that the weapons, the way you put a team comp together, and this is what we're going to lead into in just a moment, the way you put a team comp together is not just about the main weapon again. It's, you have to look at it as, if we have an NZAP 85, could it be replaced with something that does the same thing but better? In which case, like, if you want the short-range echo, you can run a Deal Scorcher. If you want the NZAP itself, you can run something like an 83, perhaps that'll fit in a little bit better. If you just want something that's, short-range, turfing, kind of madman weapon, you can run a Tenatech. So there's always sort of different options. So on that note, let's take a look at competitive compositions. Now, we can talk about things like the 52 deco here, for example, as well, but the idea that you take things holistically, you take things as the whole kit for a weapon, or the whole team for a team composition, you need to apply this if you're looking at making a synergistic team composition as well. So the difference here, though, I think, is that with a team composition, whereas with a weapon kit, you always have the sub and you always have the special, right? I mean, you could say, yeah, you don't always have the sub because you might be out of ink, or you don't always have the special because you might not be able to build it, but they're always available to you. Whereas in a team composition, that's not always the case, because say you're running a CRB and Dynamo, which we'll get to in just a moment. If the Dynamo, for example, dies, what's the CRB going to do? If the Dynamo has to go across the map to help someone else, or if the CRB ends up in the enemy team's base and the Dynamo's sort of lagging behind, how does that all mesh together? So, I guess we can start with Hermes again here. So, I believe you guys, because Dawn obviously runs Dynamo, and you've been running CRB a fair bit.
Yeah.
So, how does the CRB and Dynamo, just as a starting point, work well together? And what is it about those two weapons that allows you to work around what I was mentioning before about, when you don't have those two weapons working together directly?
Well, that's the thing. When we discussed the weapons earlier, the weapons themselves can play on their own to a decent extent. The CRB has all the tools it needs to at least be there. But again, as we've been saying, its full potential is unlocked when you have a turfing weapon behind it, like a Dynamo. And with the Dynamo specifically, especially with, I think one of the big things about running a vanilla Dynamo with a CRB is the combination of Echo Kraken, or just the Echo and the mass layer that is a CRB. Like, the Echo makes it so nice for it to activate. And then you have your CRB in a pretty aggressive position with a Dynamo right behind it. And then you just see, okay, one person is spawning out this way, there's another person on snipe over here, and you can kind of like pick and choose and hope. If you guys are in VC together, you can also like say, okay, I'm going to go after the sniper, you kind of set up a distraction and I'll just hit him with a shot or two, that kind of thing. What works really well is that the turf allows the CRB to move into those aggressive positions. The sprinkler allows the Dynamo to focus on turfing forward while the sprinkler turfs behind it. And then the Splat Bomb, the CRB's main itself, and the Kraken just all work so well together to slay anyone that comes in its path. And I think that's why it works all so well together, is that you just have everything, like what we've been talking about, synergy of kits, how they all support each other. On this, like these two weapons, the two kits for these two weapons support each other as well as themselves, which is what's so beautiful about them being run together.
Right. So, Dawn, you're the sort of other half of the CRB and Dynamo combo here. So, how is it from your perspective? So, what does the CRB in particular do for you?
Okay, both weapons, CRB and Dynamo, have a pretty respectable one-hit kill hitbox. So, if you see a CRB and Dynamo together, chances are people are going to want to scatter a bit, because if they get caught by one, they're typically going to get caught by the other. And the way Hermes and I have done this in the past, when we have done this, because I mostly run Splatling when he runs CRB, is that he would launch a shot from his blaster and I would swing afterwards. And so it's kind of like those 1-2 punches that the GRB is known for, except we get a lot more turf coverage out of it. And basically, with the CRB and Dynamo combination, I can focus on one direction inking, while Hermes can either run ahead or blast behind me. It's kind of odd to explain, because it doesn't seem like it'd work too effectively, because they're both slow weapons. They're both have a bit of a delay in firing, so they don't respond as well to frontliners that want to rush them down. But on the other hand, you have incredible kill potential, incredible inking potential, and the threat of just being pincered by two massive one-hit kill boxes. Well, not too massive anymore, but I hope my point is made somewhat clear.
Yep. Yeah, so, like, we're looking, again, like, this all comes back to synergy, which is, when you have the Dynamo and CRB working together, they work extremely well. They are more than just, a CRB that can slay and a Dynamo that can paint, because suddenly your Dynamo like, even if you get the 50 damage hitbox on the Dynamo, your CRB can then just whip around and get an indirect for, again, about 50 damage, which is an easy kill, you know? So, you know, you've got the massive AoE, and then suddenly that AoE is one-shotting you, which makes it just kind of ridiculous. Like, the Grim, one of the things that makes people lose their minds over the Grim is the fact that you can burst bomb and then blast someone. But the Grim has to do that with half its zinc tank. Whereas for you guys, you just shoot one shot and flick one wave of ink from your Dynamo, and chances are you can get like 2 kills out of that if people are trying to rush you down. But then,
especially if it's in the buddy system, like what we would be doing.
Yeah,
if people play like Civians, we're gonna get. If people play Civians, it's gonna be easy enough to kill with that duo.
Yeah, so I do want to touch on the buddy system a bit as well, though, because I think a lot of teams will sort of cling to the buddy system a bit too hard, right? So I mentioned at the start that if you, for example, have a CRB and a Dynamo, say one of them gets picked off, maybe one of them gets sniped, or one of them falls behind and gets tagged by a 10 attack or something like that, the CRB or the Dynamo, whichever one is left up, can still operate just fine, because they're strong weapons that are self-sufficient. It's just that when you bring them together, they become that much better. The difference I see in a lot of sort of buddy system team comps, say for example I'm trying to think of like a duo that you actually kind of see that sort of falls apart if one of the two people goes down. Like, I guess something like Hydra plus, I don't know, Junior. Actually, that's a good example, yeah. So, you know, the logic there would be, well, you've got the Junior and you've got the Hydra. The Junior's going to cover the Hydra's weak spot, which is, you know, if the Hydra gets jumped on while it doesn't have a charge, the Junior can take them out. You know, the Junior has the bubble, the quick bubble to handle that. The Hydra, meanwhile, can take, you know, it loves having extra turf to sort of shield it, sort of soft shield it from other people, and the Junior can supply that. But then, you know, if the Junior gets taken out, suddenly the Hydra can get rushed down. You know, the weakness is being covered by the Junior, but then as soon as the Junior's gone, the weakness is wide open, and quite often as a Hydra, you'll be relying on that coverage to sort of move up, for example. But then the Junior goes down, and suddenly you're overextended. And again, the Junior's the same kind of way, where if the Hydra gets sniped, suddenly the Junior's in a terrible position because he's sort of stuck in where the Hydra was and isn't really in any position to start doing things. So, Mango, I want to sort of just get your thoughts on this. I don't know if you have anything in particular you want to jump in with, but like, we've been talking mostly about buddy systems, but you've been leading a team for a couple of months, and you've no doubt been in charge of, you know, making team comps and whatnot. So how do you extend the buddy system to sort of work for, say, 3 or 4 people at once?
Well, generally what I do, it's mostly come down to trying out what works and kind of speculating. So I'd see, like, okay, does a Dynamo work with this weapon? Whatever. And then I'd try it out in something like squads, something where a great synergy can be established there. And then, you know, it's all like taking ideas from the community and such. And that's generally what a team captain has to do.
Right.
And I feel
so basically, like, you take the buddy system and you sort of add +1 to it and see what happens. And
yeah, there's nothing too complicated to it, I'd say, because it's pretty difficult to establish this entire economy of everything. You just have to speculate and try it out. But it does work out pretty well.
Right. So basically, again, because there are so many different variables involved, it's kind of tricky to come up with a really good team composition just sort of off the top of your head. Like, you would need a lot of trial and error to really do that, which I think, you know, I mentioned at the start, this sort of thing is actually kind of useful in solo queue, for example. Like, you can take a look at your initial team composition and say, well, what role am I going to fill? And then play accordingly. And I think you can definitely look at the buddy system in terms of in that, and you can sort of start extending on it and sort of work out some hypotheses and whatnot. But yeah, I do agree that you definitely have to actually try things out with an organized squad, or even like just in solo queue. Like if you use a weapon that relies on a bunch of other weapons being in the team, you can very easily see what happens when you don't have those weapons. Like if you run a Grim, for example, and you need that turf coverage to make sure that you always have a way in, and your team doesn't have any kind of turf coverage, suddenly you have all these problems, and it's like, yeah, this weapon clearly has some requirements for its team. But I mean, I think we have seen some examples of some really good team compositions in competitive already, and something about the way synergy works is that it doesn't have to be like two different weapons. And I think KC, for example, has shown that with how they run the double 52 gal setup. Now, with the 52s, obviously they've got the wall and whale kit, but also there's the fact that they run, all the damage up and so on. So a lot of the time you're going to have the 252 gals will put up walls at two different angles. This is KC's sort of setup. And then they'll have crossfire, where even if one person on the team doesn't run damage up and the other person does, although I think they both do stack damage up, you can sort of see how the 52 that runs damage up would then crossfire with the 52 that doesn't, and you can actually run sort of like a swim speed kind of thing, so you can have like a flanking 52 and a main pushing sort of 52 gal. And so this sort of synergy does apply to just two weapons working together as well. And I think now that we have a better idea of how that all works, we can open it up and talk about, well, the title is Derailing the Hype Train, but this is basically for examples of all these things we've been talking about. So this is chat as well. If you guys have anything you want to throw at us for this topic, go ahead. So what are some of the examples of weapons that you think are underrated or overrated, and why are these weapons not used as much as they should be, or used too much? And I think Hermes can start us off with the 52 deco perhaps.
Oh yeah. One of mine and Don's teammates, Jeremy, he's a really fun flex player. Plays a lot of odd weapons that you don't see too much. He plays the vanilla splat roller, not the crack on, the vanilla. He plays the 52 deco. He prefers it over the 52. He plays and just a bunch of other ones.
Rapid Pro deco.
Oh, yes, of course. And he does them all quite well because he understands the odd synergies of their kit. Like for the 52 deco, the kit allows it to be both more aggressive and more defensive, because you can just sit back and throw seekers if you have a good amount of ink management, which he does sometimes. And then other times he'll just run a more mobility-based kit and just use the seekers to like get into the opponent and just kill from behind. And like that's why the weapon works well. The fast kill time and the way that it works is accentuated pretty well by seekers. The ink strike is kind of it's becoming more and more like appreciated now in the West, but for a long while, especially like towards like January and February, people didn't run ink strikes because it was nearly useless. If you wanted to paint a zone, you'd have a bomb rush. If you wanted to stop a tower, you'd have a whale. If you wanted to pop the Rainmaker, you'd also have a whale or a sprinkler. And now the ink strike is becoming a little bit more appreciated. I think we can kind of see why the 52 deco works so well. And it is really underrated. Yes, the 52 gal, the vanilla does have like, it's got the wall, which is beautiful, and it's got its whale, which allows it to zone people out well. But you can't forget about the deco, because the deco can just be more flexible in its play style and go forward, go in and flank, or get behind the enemy, Or it could stay back and support an E-leader by throwing Seekers and being right beside him, so that way he blocks anyone trying to kill him.
Right, so, like, it's kind of interesting, because I haven't used a regular 52 gal in quite some time, but occasionally I'll actually break out the 52 deco, just because, like, it does actually do a lot of interesting things. Like, it's sort of a... because of the really quick kill speed, if you manage to actually get in on the back of a Seeker, which is actually quite a lot more possible, now that the Seekers don't have, like, a tiny ink trail, you can actually... you can actually reliably swim through it without getting shot, because, you know, the people will sort of not actually track it properly, for example. But yeah, then, because it's got such a quick kill time, you can very easily just jump out of ink and get a couple of kills. And, you know, it's... I actually do think it is heavily underrated. It's something that I actually see quite a bit in this chat as well. Like, a bunch of people are still saying, like, you know, the 52 deco is quite underrated. And my personal thing is, of course, sloshes. So, like, I've sort of stopped using them, partly because I'm trying to focus on CRB. But the sloshes are kind of ridiculous. Like, particularly the slosher deco. I know, you know, obviously the regular slosher has the burst bomb combos, and the soda slosher has, like, splat bomb, which is just generally really nice, and the Inksuka, which, again, like... But then the splat bomb and Inksuka with the slosher, it's kind of a bit weird. I've found, like, I've sort of used it a bit, but it's... I've always found it kind of awkward as compared to something like the slosher deco, where the slosher deco is a very mobile weapon, surprisingly enough. Like, you don't really stand still and slosh with it. You sort of... You can jump around and sort of do crazy stuff with it. And then you got the Kraken, kind of like the CRB. It works in a similar way. And, of course, the wall keeps you alive in frankly, stupid situations. Like, the whole point of the sloshes is to abuse terrain that makes shooting at you awkward, for example. And the wall sort of works with that really well, because you can put a wall up to make it so that they can't just sort of... Say, on Triggerfish, you've got that little box on the zone. If you stand behind that with a slosher and just sort of strafe around it, there's not much the enemy team can do about it, because chances are they aren't going to be able to shoot at you, but you can just flick over the box, right? And then with the wall, you can block off their ability to actually strafe around the box themselves, and then suddenly you're basically invulnerable, even though you're standing right next to them. So that's, you know, that's another way that, for example, the wall still gives you all the things that a wall will give you normally, but then you also have the sort of extra utility in that as well. I think there are a bunch of calls in the chat for saying that the Krakon and Eagle are overrated. I don't know if anyone wants to jump on either of those.
I'll take that one point about the E-Leader.
Right.
I don't normally talk about the E-Leader. I don't normally bash it, because one of my teammate here, Hermes, is an Eliter main, and he's a pretty dead shot with it. I know the value of an E-Leader, but I personally feel that it's overrated. I mean, if you look at the Japanese scene, they've pretty much dropped the E-Leader in most cases, with the exceptions of maps like maybe Moray or whatever. And they focused more on Splatlings, particularly the Hydra Splatling, which I have also picked up and done well with. And I'm thinking here that it's a duality. People overrate the E-Leaders and underrate the Hydras a bit. I don't think that an E-Leader should be run on nearly every map and mode, like what some people thinks this E-Leader craze in the West is all about. Like, yeah, totally, should run a leader on Black Belly. I'm thinking here, no, that's not the best idea in the world. You really shouldn't do that. I think the West just has a big E-Leader fetish. I mean,
Right.
let's face it, we all kind of do. But, yeah, I think in a lot of maps, what you can do with an E-Leader, you can easily do it with Splatter Scope or a Hydra Splatling.
Right. Now, I do sort of agree with you, but I do want to actually say, because especially after the first episode where we were sort of harping on how the West does things compared to Japan, I do want to say that the E-Leader for me has always been, like, it's kind of a gambit. Like, it's extremely powerful if you have someone who can, hit shots, and you have a team that works around, painting for you and so on. But at the same time, I think part of the reason why Japan doesn't tend to use E-leaders is because they sort of have a bunch of people who, like, main somewhat random weapons. Like, there's a lot of specialization in the Japanese scene. So you'll see people who use nothing but, like, ink brush Nouveau or something, And if you run E-leader on every team comp, because, again, like, if you specialize in Japan, it's like there's going to be E-leader specialists, there's going to be splatterscope specialists and whatnot. It's a lot harder to fit an E-leader into a team comp because you need to have that sort of synergy with your team. You need to actually understand what they're doing. And it's a lot harder to do that with the sort of pickup squad culture that they have, where a lot of the time you'll just sort of grab a bunch of players and make a team for a little bit. So I do actually think that the sort of correct, quote-unquote, way to look at the E-leader is kind of a middle ground. I do think that the painting is really, really important, but at the same time, the cross-map slaying potential is quite crazy as well. So, particularly in this game where you don't have infinite range on your weapons, like you quite often do in other shooters.
Mm. Yeah, and actually, like, I am an E-leader main, and yes, I've maxed out both of them, but, like, I've been playing the Splattershot Junior a lot. I've been playing... I'm picking up the custom jet now, which I saw earlier in chat was one of the weapons that's underrated. I completely agree with that. And I also play the CRB and Grim. And the reason why is because I understand, and especially with the flexibility that our team name goes here has, like, we have Dawn who can play, like, he plays Hydras and Dynamos. So if a map is more Hydra suited than E-leader suited, I'll play something a little bit more like a Grim Range or a CRB. Whereas if it's more E-leader suited, then I'll play E-leader and he'll play Dynamo. And it works really well because in both of those circumstances, the synergy is higher. And again, on like the synergy between two, E-leader and Dynamo work so well together because the Dynamo keeps a line of contention or pushes it forward with its painting, while an E-leader is able to protect the Dynamo from a really safe distance. And through that, like, it just goes back and forth, and the kits work well together as well. It's more on that synergy thing. And yeah, it's really I do think, like, I'm starting to use E-leaders less and less, unless it's a Towers game or a Bluefin game, because I see, even as a sniper main, that hey, there's other things that I could be doing that could be more beneficial.
Right. So yeah, Mango, any like, you've played so many different weapons, there's surely something that you've sort of tinkered with that was a little bit more niche, shall we say?
Well, I could continue about the E-leader. I just recently maxed it out.
Right.
So for the E-leader, I feel it plays a really good structural role. It's essentially like a manager, and it can make sure everyone's doing the right thing and nothing goes wrong, which is pretty important. And I think that's why I don't think it's really overrated. The overmass of every single map, maybe, but I feel the continuation of the weapon should be something that the scene looks at.
Right. So
As for other weapons that are overrated, no, nothing comes to mind right now. Sorry.
Okay, I actually have a bit of a talk I want to do as well on overrated weapons. I mean, I main it. I've been maining it since June 2015, but I think that people overrate the Dynamo a little bit. I personally still think it's the best support weapon in the game, but not to the point where I'd run it on every map or every mode. Like, I just feel like people slightly overrate it a bit. Because with the Dynamo, it'll suffer on smaller maps, like, say, Port. And people, I forget which team I was playing with. they're like, yeah, go Dynamo and port macro, and I'm thinking here, this is before tempered Dynamo, by the way. So I'm thinking here, okay, what do I do? I'm kind of lost. Oh yeah, it was with the Visionaries. Yeah, they had me run Dynamo everything. I mean, I don't blame them either. I love Dynamo still, but I think that Dynamo is not the invulnerable beast that some people make it to be. At the same time, though, I don't think it's the trash that others make it to be either. It's in that middle ground where it's a strong weapon, but it's not oppressive.
Right. So, like, it's obviously with all the nerfs it's had. It may have originally been.
What I said makes a bit of sense, I hope.
Yeah. Because, like, what originally the Dynamo was a very, very powerful weapon because of, before all the nerfs, it did kind of get some crazy kills, particularly before they actually gave it the 50 damage hitbox, where anything that hit you from a Dynamo had the potential to kill you, even if it was, like, the very edge of the flick. Which...
Oh, I got DC'd, so I missed a bunch of conversation.
Oh, no, I think we got it.
Basically my point is the Dynamo is not the uber beast that people make it to be, but it's not trash either. That was my point.
Yeah, I think we actually did. I certainly heard it. I don't know if maybe you just disconnected
Yeah, I got
temporarily
it too.
or
It might
something.
have been. Yeah.
Yeah, no, because I do agree with that. Like, and I think the turfing is never going to go away, right? Like that's its main thing, and that's one of the main strengths that it has. As you say, it's still an incredibly good support weapon. It's just, it doesn't do everything like it used to, where it used to be able to just sort of wipe enemy teams by just sort of looking at them sideways. It can't really do that anymore. So MH in chat brings up the Berry Pro. So this I actually find kind of interesting, because I don't think it's overhyped in the slightest, but I also think that it hasn't been really given the time of day because people overhyped it. That's a contradiction, but I think the weapon itself is extremely good, because the Suction Rush is one of the most oppressive things in the game, right? Like, if you have a Suction Rush down, there's an entire section of the map that the enemy team just cannot enter. But at the same time, and so obviously the Pro itself is an extremely good weapon, and the suctions work well with it again because it gives it an extra way of painting. It's relatively safe, so it can get quite a few Suction Rushes. And then because the way the Suction Rush works, where you get like half your special back once it ends, you can actually build a bunch of Suction Rushes, particularly because the berry does tend to stay alive. So, like, I don't think that the hype was misplaced. I think that there's a very good reason why the Berry Pro is is considered high-tier weapon, or was, like, massively hyped when it came out. But at the same time, people sort of grabbed it, started playing it, tried to use it like a Tenatech or whatever, and then forgot that in order to use the Berry Pro, you need to have, like, good aim, and you need to actually be able to track targets. Even though the Berry Pro got its buff where you get, faster bullets, you still have to be able to track targets at long range, which is something that a lot of people just don't learn how to do because they're, using Tenatech or whatever. Whereas, you see people like Dude using it, and it's like, wow, this weapon is kind of nuts. So, and of course the 96 Deco. Is someone want to talk about the 96 Deco? I'm sure everyone has an opinion on the 96 Deco post-patch. So,
I think the lack of gear independency that ended up coming out of the patch is what ticked people off the most about post-patch. I think that if you, say, run a little bit of damage, damage is actually even more important on a 96, because 96 you're even more likely to have fall off than a 52. So you need a little bit more damage sometimes, or you just need the damage more. But yeah, post-patch, because it has the accuracy, it's more accurate now. It's still kind of wide, but it's not nearly as bad as it was before. it works. Like, I think the trade-off for needing to stack damage, but now it's more accurate, it makes it so that way those people who were getting, like, they were shooting in a general direction and then 1-2 ticks hit them. And they got the kill because they were just running a bunch of defense and they were able to actually miss one of their shots and then they got the 2 or something like that. Now that they need to run damage, it's causing people who play the 96 deco, you actually need to be really skilled with the weapon. And I actually feel like right now it's kind of underrated as a slayer, like just a straight slayer. There's a lot of people who just completely dropped it straight up. They tried to learn it and they're like, I don't like this, and then drop it, and then they switch to, say, a 10 attack or a pro. But I'm pretty sure if they just like toss all their old knowledge of the 96 out of their mind and then went into it with a new mindset, they could probably start liking it again. Or if it's just that they don't like the gear dependency that now it has, then okay, run a 10 attack where you're pretty gear independent.
Yeah, like, something interesting about the 96 is the main reason it was inaccurate was not actually its spread, which I think was either identical to or, like, slightly more than the Dual Scorcher. But when we were initially testing the game back in, like, whatever, June or might have been August, what we found, or rather what Nike found specifically, because he was the one who was doing most of the testing, was that the Dual Scorcher could hit, say, I think it was 88% of its shots at max range, whereas the 96 Gal could only hit about 78%. Even though the 96 Gal had only very slightly larger spread, the Dual Scorcher was missing far fewer shots, right? And the reason for this isn't actually because of the spread, but because of a bunch of other sort of hidden variables in the way that the spread is sort of calculated. And none of those variables changed, which is why the 96 Gal is still sort of... Like, people thought that the accuracy buff meant that the accuracy was going to suddenly be perfect, when in fact it still has the same little quirks that you need to master in order to use the 96 Gal properly. And this is why, like, you see a bunch of top Japanese players who just kept maining the 96 Gal regardless. A lot of them still are perfectly fine with using it, because there's the quirks, like, I'm still sort of personally trying to research them and figure them out a bit better, but it does actually seem as though they're not predictable so much as they are something you can work around, like something you can react to. So yeah. Anyway, we had a question in chat about the Hydra, and I think Dawn wanted to jump on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think that actually I think he brought up Vanilla Hydra beforehand.
Yes.
But I also want to talk about custom. Vanilla Hydra is, I personally feel it's an underrated weapon, but the main issue is that it faces so much competition for its various niches. Like, if you want a long-range weapon, you could use Eliter, you could use Custom Hydra, you could use splatter scopes, and then you can even use the custom variant itself gives the Vanilla Hydra quite a bit of competition. And then for Echoes, you got, again, Eliters, Dynamos, Dual Squelchers, the whole 9 yards. The Hydra Vanilla just had a lot of competition for its team slot, and it doesn't help that the custom variant of the Hydra is so oppressively good. It definitely does not help. Because in most cases, if you see a Hydra, you can reasonably predict that it'll throw sprinklers and have bubbles as soon as you approach it. So,
Right.
yeah, I personally feel that both variants are still a bit underrated in the Western scene, not so much in the Japanese scene, where you see a lot more Hydras like Canon, the Bird, and others on Open Rec.
Which, by the way, you can find in the Academy's media channel.
Humble
for
plug.
those of you who still aren't in the server for whatever reason.
Get in here.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think, because one of the team comps, I think we were going to bring this up earlier, that we wanted to talk about was the sort of standard comp of, you know, your 52, your 10 attack, Lunar Blaster, and Eliter. So this is a team comp. again, this is a KC thing, but a bunch of other teams do run team comps very similar to this. And I just want to talk about it because I think it's sort of a standard composition, and you can sort of take it as a bit of a baseline for how to assess other compositions. And Hermes, I think you wanted to talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, I find that probably right now I consider, or at least I don't know, one of them has fell off a bit recently. The two most successful teams, at least in the summer, have been Extermination and Chimera. Now, Chimera I just find as an oddball just because they have so many Slayers that just gets kills all the time, and that's why they do well. But which is fine, like that works. But you have Extermination, which has you normally are going to have a 52 or a 52 and a 10 attack, double 52 or a double 10 attack. You're going to have Kagu on Luna, who's just insane, like absolutely insane with that weapon. And then you have Echo on E-Leader. And the way that they synergize as a group is just, it's astoundingly powerful because you have the two shooters who are always together, kind of just picking people off, like almost systematically. You have the E-Leader in the back that's just watching over everyone and kind of, I don't know if they VC, but if they do, he's almost definitely kind of helping guide them to where they need to go. And then you just have Kagu just roaming around in the paint, just picking off people that are trying to move elsewhere. And it's why you see them always just being able to run through teams. And that has become a standard composition. And I feel like it works well, but it has some major hard counters, especially on certain maps, if you have the right people. I think that if you just have like a pro and a pro or a dynamo, something that just outranges the non-E-Leader aspects of that team that can just take care of them constantly, then that kind of shuts down the comp. The real weakness of that comp is the range. And so to counter that, you would put in a pro instead of a 10 attack or something like that. And there's a lot of little things you can do to help mitigate some of the weaknesses. But it's really good, but also does have its weaknesses. And if they're going up against a team that plays to the weakness of that composition, they can beat Extermination. And I mean, that's happened, but also if they don't, they're just going to get throttled. So that's just my kind of 2 cents on that.
Right. So, again, it's sort of the, like we were talking about with the buddy system, how, when they've got the buddy system working and it's all, the 10 attack is getting paint down, the Luna's doing its sharking thing and so on. It works really well, but then as soon as the 10 attack, for example, or rather, as soon as the Luna's out of control, or the 10 attack can't get paint down, or, the other team somehow pushes their turf back, right, is sort of when things start to fall over. So, part of why I wanted to bring that up is exactly that reason, is because Extermination finds plenty of success with this team comp. You don't have to have a perfect team comp. You don't have to have a team comp that will never ever fall apart. Sometimes there are just going to be games where you do get hard countered. There are sometimes going to be games where, your weakness maybe does get exploited. But at the same time, there's a difference between like having a perfect team comp and a team comp that is like Extermination's, that people can just sort of they can run whatever they want. Or rather, the team is running its thing, but then other teams can run whatever they want, and you still have some way of winning, So with Extermination, the simple thing is that they just get a lot of turf down. Once they get a lot of turf down, then the rest of the team can very easily operate, even if the other team seemingly has a counter composition. And sure, sometimes it falls apart, but for the most part, they have a way back in, and they have easy ways of getting wins when the other team has to work that much harder to actually exploit their weakness. So Mango, I honestly don't know that much about S3, but I know that obviously leading it, you would have had to handle, other team compositions and so on a fair bit. So what did you find was, like, with your team composition, something that you found, like, difficult to deal with?
Well, a lot of the time, because it's constant respawning, and that's the thing. Because sometimes if my team is a bit unstable, I'd have to completely re-establish everything. But so it's a lot of, because of the fact that it's a lot of re-establishing in my case. I'd have to, there's be some weakness always. But I feel, just because of the fact that I always went back to the synergizing and everything, went back, okay, let's start a tri squad, let's start a regular squad. Because of that, we all kind of do know what the weaknesses are. And because of the fact that that is a thing, dealing with them hasn't been the largest problem. And so that's why I find that's important. So I can't really point out a specific weakness because it's ran for a really long time, but just take that as my general response.
Right. Yeah, so, I mean, I think we can wrap up on one point that was actually brought up on the Discord server. So Setu was asking what the relationship between a weapon being independent, so for example a Tenatech being self-sufficient or a CRB or whatever, and having a variety of different weapons and roles on your team. So I guess this would be a good... The reason I want to end on this is because next week we're going to be sort of extending this topic and talking about strategies. So how to actually take what your team composition is and take the weapons within that team composition and actually place them around the map and have sort of a game plan and so on. But for this, I want to touch on... This I do want to touch on just to sort of close things out, because I think the balance, like having something like a Tenatech that can function in any situation is sort of a... like, say you have a puzzle and that's your team, like you can fit the Tenatech in whichever slot. It doesn't really matter. Like the team can use a Tenatech pretty much no matter what. And that's fine. Like it's a good sort of structural weapon where you just put a Tenatech in and you can be reasonably assured that your turf control isn't going to be too bad. Your slaying ability is going to be pretty decent. You can have something that can, pop out of ink and kill people who are trying to rush your long ranges down. But at the same time, you have... Like, your Tenatech can only be in one place at once, right? You can't have it doing... You can't have it slaying in the enemy team's base while also protecting your E-leader. You need to have someone else doing that. So that's where you start to look at... if your Tenatech is going to be playing a flex role, then you need to have things that it can sort of trade off with, I think. So I don't know if you guys want to weigh in on this, but like the self-sufficiency in a weapon means that when a weapon is sort of in a situation it doesn't want to be in, it can still function. So a CRB can, direct enemies to stay alive in situations where it's completely surrounded or whatever. The Dynamo can, because it puts so much turf out, it sort of can force people back. It can sort of win those sort of one-on-one fights and so on like that. Yeah, I don't know if you guys want to weigh in on that real quick.
I mean, if we're going off of that, yeah, like the Tenatech is super self-sufficient. I would also argue the 52 is incredibly self-sufficient on a little bit more of a I can stand my ground rather than I'm moving around you kind of way. However, then you have, we have the elephant in the room who we still haven't talked about yet, the Zinc Mini Splatling, which I argue is easily like, if not the best weapon, one of the top 5 best weapons in the game, because again, the synergy of the kit is really good. But it builds bubble like nothing. The disruptor makes it hard to escape. You know the drill. And and like Phlox in our voiced VC, our voice text chat, he brought up that the Tenatech and the Luna are pretty self-sufficient because they can be aggressive with each other or on their own. But then you have the CRB and the Zimmy, which are just so good together because they're both more passive and they can just throw people off super hard. And the combination works really well too. You can have a disrupted person just fall prey to two mediocre indirects from a CRB. You can have a CRB bubbled is scary as hell too. Because then after it's bubbled, it just goes in Krakens and kills you even more. It's while both weapons can be like a little bit more on their own, they synergize really well together also. And I feel like that the Zimmy is one of those kinds of weapons where, yeah, it's all right on its own. But when it's supporting others, and I'm pretty sure Hitzel, if he, it doesn't look like he's online, but I'm pretty sure Hitzel can definitely attest to this, being that he mains it because the disruptors are such a beautiful support and the bubble. Like, it works so well with a group of others, and a lot of people have started running a Zimmy over a Tenatech because of that.
Right.
Another thing on the application of independence in a weapon or I can't speak English right now, is again, a lot of this boils down to individual skill. If you have a godlike CRB on your team, he's gonna be able to pull himself out of a tough situation easier, out of a bad situation easier than say a Tenatech who doesn't know as much about what he's doing with the weapon. You can't just focus on a weapon by itself. I mean, I know we assumed that skills were constant in the beginning, but that's a very real. But skill is a very real thing. You have to factor into this as well.
Yeah. Mango, you got anything to add for this?
Oh, I think they covered it pretty well.
Well,
and on the topic of team compositions, actually, I pretty much said what I wanted to say. Never mind me. Sorry about that.
All right. Well, I think we're going to end it there because we do have next week. We're going to be talking about the team strategies, how we actually put everything together, put all the stuff we've been talking about today together. We could probably extend on this a little bit further as well around then, so we might sort of lead into that. But until then, any closing words from you guys? Let's start with Dawn.
Shout out to the Splatling community. I love you guys. Shout out to Roller Discord. I love you guys too. Shout out to Team Name Goes Here and to FLC for hosting this show.
All right, Hermes.
You can follow me on Twitter at Tritone. I interrupt people because it's the closing statement. I'm so sorry about that.
Yep. No, it's all good. Yep, Hermes.
You'll see me around. I used to be around a bit more just because I was not hella busy, but now I am, but I still find time to come out and talk about these things. I've always been super interested in how the game works as a science. It's why I've been following a lot of what FLC has done since kind of he started, and why I'm like happy to be here talking about these things. And I do want to give a shout out to one of my good friends who got me into like fully competitive. He was one of the people who taught me how to snipe. Dan, he was in chat earlier. He's a fantastic person. He's now a free agent, I think, which is unfortunate because he's great. And like seriously, I would not be here without that guy. Like he deserves a lot of props.
All right, and Mango.
Shout out to the Mango. I'm just Mango. And yeah, you'll just find me around the Discord. You should join that, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's good.
All right, thanks for being on the show, guys. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and if you want to get any more of this kind of discussion, head on over to the Academy server. It's in the title of the stream or in the description if you're catching up on YouTube. Next week, again, we're talking about strategies and how we take all the stuff we've been talking about this week and put it into an actual effective strategy that you can use to maybe even win some tournaments, who knows. But until then, this has been FLC with the Squidcast. See you guys later.